Hello everybody, April, aka the Cube Connoisseur, back for another top 10 video for Magic the Ametrine. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 problems with the Legacy Cube. Before I get started, I want to say that I'm a little bit nervous about this one because I love Cube. I love it so much, and I'm concerned that if I say negative things about the Cube, that it will discourage people from cubing, and that's not what I want. Like, I want to have more people cubing because the more people that are cubing, the more people that are having fun, and the more people that I get to share my enjoyment with. But nevertheless, I think that the Legacy Cube has a lot of problems, and I think this is important information that hopefully will be taken into account in future iterations of the Legacy Cube. So number 10 is that it's too expensive. Now I know I talk about this a lot, so before you roll your eyes and stop the video, just listen to me one more time here. The Legacy Cube leagues take in 800 player points for each draft, and they pay out 560. Now this is the kind of payout, I think, that would make the most villainous, mustache-twirling casino owner just like a bit aghast. Like, this is a 30% rake. I think they can get away with that, in the vintage cube, where if you think of the vintage cube as like a BMW M4, with 6-speed manual transmission and with 20-inch wheels and like optional neck warmers, like that's the vintage cube. And they're asking people to pay the same price for a Honda Civic, and that's the Legacy Cube. I think the high price not only deters people from entering, but I think it just kind of leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. I know that it's important for money to exit the economy. Like, this is just a money sink. There's no risk to Wizards. Like, it's not adding packs to the economy. It's not adding treasure chests to the economy or cards to the economy. It's just a money sink. And a 30% rake is just too high. I don't know if the solution is to, cut the rake in half, like cut it to 15%, or just cut the entry fee in half to 50 tickets. But there's gotta be, I think something needs to change. It's just too expensive. If it were cheaper, I think more people would be entering the leagues, and I think that would be great. So number 9 is that it doesn't feel very Legacy. Blue has, I think, the most cards that are in Legacy but not in Modern, at like 17 of their 80-some cards. But it goes down from there. You have like 9 for red and 6 for green. So like when you draft it, you're often just opening up a pack of all Modern cards. And you look at the pack and you think, where's the Legacy? Where are the sweet things that people do in Legacy? Where are the show and tells and sneak attacks? Where is the storm? Like, where are the really fun, cool things that you expect to see in a Legacy Cube? The Legacy Cube that Wizards has is just so low-powered and mid-range that it feels very much like a kind of almost a cross between like Modern and Standard. It doesn't feel very Legacy at all. So number 8 is that it's actually really hard to prepare for. I know that sounds weird, but if you want to look at the Legacy Cube list on Wizards' website, all you get is an alphabetical list. You can sort it by color or converted mana cost, but it's 100 cards per page. There's no easy way to look at it and say, like, here are the cards in the cube. You can only see 100 of the 600 cards at a time. The interface is unusable for preparing for the cube. Now, if you know that there are people like myself out there that take those lists and put them up on a cube tutor, where you can see the whole cube on a single page, sorted by color and type, then you have a big advantage. But if you are not, if you're just like looking at the online list, it's very hard to prepare. And that's a problem because there are actually a lot of trap cards in the Wizards Cube. You have things like Breeding Pool, which is a trap I think in most every cube, but you have Dark Ritual and Mirari's Wake when there's no storm. You have Nahiri when there are no Eldrazi. You have Nico Bolas when there's no artifact ramp to get to Nico Bolas. You have Upheaval when there's only, like I said, there's only 2 pieces of artifact ramp in the whole cube. So you might open up a sweet Upheaval and think, this is great, I'm gonna draft an Upheaval deck, and like the packs are going by and you don't see any artifact mana, and you think, wow, did I just screw up my draft? But you didn't. You drafted properly, you just didn't know that there's just nothing to go with it in the cube. And you don't know that because it's very hard to prepare. So coming in at number 7, there are too many sweepers in the cube. Now, for those of you who don't know, a sweeper is a card that tries to kill all of the creatures on the battlefield. So it might be things like Wrath of God and Day of Judgment, or Toxic Deluge, or Anger of the Gods. And it's okay to have a lot of sweepers in your cube, But the Wizard's Cube, I think, has just too many. It has, I believe, at least 18. 18 of their 600 cards are sweepers, and they're very suppressive to a number of strategies in the cube. And that would be fine. You know, that would be fine that it's suppressive to a certain strategy. It's good for decks to have counters to other strategies. But the problem is that there are just not enough archetypes that work around sweepers. There's just not enough combo-y decks that just don't care that your opponent has like 3 sweepers in their deck. Most of the decks in this cube are based around creatures. A lot of them are mid-range creatures, and having so many sweepers makes those decks kind of weak to a lot of the control decks that are very, very strong, I think, in this cube. As a follow-up to number 7, where there are too many sweepers, coming in number 6 is that there are way too many planeswalkers in the cube. The cube is 600 cards, and there are 46 planeswalkers in the cube. Now, they play very well with all of the sweepers, right? If you do a sweeper into a planeswalker is good, and so is a planeswalker into a sweeper. There's not a lot of ways to deal with them in the cube. And they kind of lead to a gameplay state that is just very repetitive, turn after turn after turn. In my own cube, it's 720 cards, and I have 30 planeswalkers. And that's like my upper limit. You know, some people have more, but this cube I think has the highest percentage of planeswalkers that I've ever seen in a cube. I've done the Legacy Cube and recorded for Magic the Ametrine a whole bunch of times. I think my current record is 22-2. And what I found that is, if you just draft a deck with lots of planeswalkers, you're going to 3-0 a lot of the time. There's just not a lot of answers to them. Sure, like you can look at one planeswalker and think, well, this is good, right? You might play an Elspeth and that's good and it can create a chump blocker, but then you go Elspeth into Gideon, and then you go Gideon into Tamiyo, and then you go Tamiyo into Jace, and it's just impossible for any deck in the format to kind of catch up with that. You're just generating too much advantage turn after turn after turn. So you might be thinking to yourself, is 46 out of 600 that many planeswalkers? I mean, is it really that bad? And I think the answer is yes. That's 1 out of every 13 cards in the cube is a planeswalker. Imagine if you were going to your first draft of Aether Revolt and you open up your pack and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. There are 2 planeswalkers in this pack. And you take one, you're a little sad to pass it to the left. Then you open your next one, you're like, oh my gosh, there's a planeswalker in here too. They passed a planeswalker. And then you keep kicking cards around and you're like, I've got 5 or 6 or 7 planeswalkers in your deck. You would eventually think to yourself, this format is absurd. There's some serious problems with this format. And planeswalkers cause those same problems. They just warp the cube. They make other strategies just tough to draft. They screw up a lot of archetypes. They're hard to deal with. Having a cube with this many planeswalkers, I think it's just a bad design choice. So they need to definitely tone down the number of planeswalkers. I get the feeling that, they thought people love planeswalkers, so why don't we just put a whole bunch of planeswalkers in the cube and everybody will be super happy because they get to open up and play with planeswalkers. But while that makes for a cool experience when you open up a pack, it makes for kind of a poor actual cubing experience. So coming in at number 5 it's kind of hard to give it a title actually. I think the title I would choose is just the combat is too easy. I've played a lot of cubes, including many peasant and pauper cubes, and these are cubes that are just filled with commons or commons and uncommons. And they actually have a very similar feel to the Legacy Cube, obviously minus all the planeswalkers. And one of the things that kind of defines those cubes is that they're so heavily combat oriented, right? But in this cube, there's only 2 equipment really worth playing. And one of them is only an honorary equipment in Batterskull. So the only real equipment that you want to be playing is Bone Splitter. So, there's no you're not really looking at your board and thinking, all right, where should I move my equipment around for it to be the most effective? There's also very few combat tricks. One of the cool things about that rewards people with, peasant and pauper cubes is that over time, you learn the combat tricks. It's kind of the same as any draft format, right? When you sit down and draft Aether Revolt, and the first few times that you play it, you get blown up by a combat trick. And then later on, you start to think, I wonder if they have, this particular combat trick open. And later on you find out that they did. You feel great about yourself. You think, I am learning this format. This is so cool. I'm getting better as things go along. With this cube, there's just, aside from removal, most combat is just what you see is what you're going to get. And in a cube that is so mid-rangey and so combat-based like this one, I think, the fact that there's just so little to do in combat aside from aside from smashing creatures into each other, kind of makes the format just a little bit dull. It doesn't make it exciting. It doesn't make players feel like they figured out a puzzle. So coming in at number 4 is that the power level is uneven. This is only true for a handful of cards, and this is, I think, a mistake that you see a lot of cube designers make when they're really new. But this cube is 5 years old, so they should have probably figured this out by now. So in my opinion, there are 3 cards that are just incredibly defining and just so powerful in this cube that, you just always want to be doing them, and they're just so much better than all the other strategies. And those cards are Treachery, Opposition, and Recurring Nightmare. All 3 of these cards have a power level that is just way, way above the power level of the average card in this cube. And that would be okay if there were other cool, broken, interesting strategies that you could do. If you could show and tell, if you could sneak attack, if you could channel, if you could tinker, lots of counter spells or easy counters to these things, it would be fine. Which is kind of a shame because I love casting all 3 of those cards. They're why I draft Legacy Cube. They're all in my Legacy Cube. And I want to see them in a Legacy Cube. It's just that this Legacy Cube in particular is so powered down that I think they either need to take these cards out of the cube or they need to add some stuff into the cube to make it a little more powerful. So coming in at number 3 is that I think there are too few archetypes in this cube. There's not really any combo deck aside from Splinter Twin in this cube, and Splinter Twin is pretty weak. I don't think it's I have 3-0'd with it, but I don't think it's a great deck just because there's relatively few cantrips and there's not really any tutors for it. So it's, sometimes you win with Splinter Twin, but it's certainly not a great deck, I don't think. But there's no other combo decks in the format. There's only one aggro deck that I think that is consistently good, and that is the mono white aggro deck. I think the mono red deck is too weak. There's no cool wildfire upheaval deck. There's just a lot of archetypes missing from this cube. It really just feels like mid-range planeswalkers, or mono green, or mono white sometimes, or a blue blaze control deck. That just feels like when you go into it that you see your cards and you know exactly what archetype you're going to be in right off the bat. There just needs to be more variety of things to do in the cube. And that leads perfectly into number 2, and that is that the cube is just too on rails. If you take your first few cards, you see what's open, you know exactly what you're going to be drafting for the whole rest of the cube. It just feels like it doesn't reward creativity. I have pushed very hard in many of my cube videos that I have done to really go outside of what it seems that the cube designers want you to do, but it's very, very difficult in this cube. It just feels like you go in, you know exactly what you want, you're pushed into that exact deck. I don't think I've ever finished a cube, even trying, where at the end of it I was surprised at what came out. I don't think I've sat across from a deck in all of the matches I've played where I'm surprised at the deck my opponent played. One of my favorite things about my own cube is how even years after having built it and been playing it, I'm still sometimes surprised about the new decks that people draft and build. That sort of thing is very rewarding to me as a cube builder, but it's also fun as a player, to sit down and be like, oh my gosh, they totally got me there. I didn't see that coming. That I think is, that kind of sense of discovery and the feeling of creation, I think is the best part about cube. And because this cube is it's just so linear in the drafting, you never feel like at the end of it that you did something, that you created something from your own mind. You just don't. You just feel like, I drafted a mono white deck, I drafted a mono green deck, I drafted a control deck. But you don't feel like that was you who did it. You feel like it was Wizards who pushed you into that deck. I don't want this to come across like there's no space in a cube for a linear deck. There definitely needs to be linear draft strategies. When you're a new player and you sit down for a cube for the first time, knowing that you can go into a blue control deck is very comforting. You know it will be decent. You kind of know what you need to have. You need to have counter spells and removal, right? But if you have only linear strategies like this cube does, you end up discouraging the experienced players, the people who love cube, who love coming up with new strategies. You need to have both linear and non-linear strategies to make the cube something that can be drafted again and again and again and just have a lot of longevity. So coming in at number 1, and I think this is the hardest for me to say because I love cube and I want people to be drafting cube, but to be honest, it's not fun. I've played a lot of cubes. I've played dozens of cubes in my life, and I've played this cube since the original one years ago, and I've played the vintage cube and the legendary cube. I've played all of these cubes in real life and online, and I actually think this might be the least fun cube I've ever drafted. You know, it has a very design by committee kind of data-driven analysis sort of feel to it. It's like Wizard said, people don't like dying to mono red. So let's take out the best mono red cards so that they're not dying to mono red. So let's take out Searing Blaze, let's take out Fire Blast, let's take out Sulfuric Vortex, you know? But then of course, you know, without a mono red strategy in the format, you can't have dirtily combo decks because those decks are punished by mono red strategies. You can't have, you know, the control decks become too good because they're not punished by mono red strategies. So I personally have two tests that I have invented for my own cube and other people's cubes when people ask me to evaluate them. And these are tests that I apply specifically to cubes that are vintage cubes or legacy cubes. And the first test, and I think the most important test, is what I call the mono red test. And the mono red test simply is that if mono red is completely open, when that happens, that mono red deck should have an above average chance of going 3-0. And in this cube, I think it fails the mono red test. I have been in mono red drafts where I've gotten every single mono red card. I've gotten Lightning Bolts, and I've got Chain Lightnings, and Goblin Guides, and Fiery Confluences. They've all come to me, and yet I could not go 3-0. When you have a cube that does not have a strong mono red strategy, it ends up warping the rest of the environment. So mono red is usually very good at punishing the blue X control decks, like the blue white control decks and the blue black control decks, because they're just so slow. Sure, they might have a sweeper on turn 4, but you've already done 14 damage to them and you can just finish them off with burn. And it also punishes the dirtily combo decks, you know, the decks that take 5 or 6 turns to come together to do something very cool. And when you don't have a valid mono red strategy in the format, you have to then warp those other decks so that they're not too good. So this cube fails, in my opinion, fails the mono red test. And also fails kind of a little sub-test I have, and I call that the Kitchen Finks test. Now, Kitchen Finks is a fine creature. You know, when everybody looks at Kitchen Finks, they think, this is a fine card. It gains 4 life, that's pretty good. It's got a 3/2 body for 3, that's fine. You know, and it's resilient to removal. That's also fine. But you shouldn't look at Kitchen Finks and think, this is a very good card in this particular environment. If your environment is a legacy cube or a vintage cube, you should always just think, it's fine, but you should never be excited to play Kitchen Finks. And in this cube, I usually am. You know, just because it's so good against the blue X control decks, it's good against people who are trying to do mono red. You know, it buys you time in your mid-range planeswalker control decks because you can just chump block and it comes back, and you know, it's a card that is above average in power level, I think, in this cube, and I think that's a failed design. Kitchen Finks should only ever be average, I think, or slightly below in a legacy or vintage cube draft. So in conclusion, I think this cube has a very, you know, again, it has a very design by committee feel to it. And I think they put in a lot of cards that people like. They put in a lot of strategies that people like. People like drafting control decks. They like drafting, you know, white aggressive-y decks. They like drafting, you know, big green rampy decks. But I don't think this cube has much stuff that when you look at it and you finish building your deck, and at the end of it you think, I don't know if this deck is good, but I love what I have done. This feeling, the fact of you just like everything you do, but you don't love it, is something that Mark Rosewater warns about a lot for game designers. He talks a lot about how if people like your game, but they don't love it, it will fail. And I think the Legacy Cube is filled with things that I like, but it has like nothing that I love. And because of that, I just think the Legacy Cube, it's just not fun. It just needs a redesign. It needs them to go back to the drawing board and make it feel like a legacy cube that people sit down and actually have a lot of fun drafting.